Hello there. Today we are going to divide what really happened in the Salem Witch Trials. In the winter of 1692, Salem village lay shivering under a blanket of snow and silence. The Puritan settlers who had carved their lives into the cold New England earth were not strangers to hardship. They feared the wilderness surrounding them, with its howling wolves and whispered stories of native spirits. They feared God, too, perhaps even more. Their lives were governed by Scripture, their thoughts shaped by sermons, and their sleep haunted by the promise of damnation. This was a world where every illness, every crop failure, every stillbirth could be explained by only one thing: sin. The Puritans believed that evil was not just possible, it was present, creeping among them, wearing the face of a neighbor or even a child. In this world, suspicion didn't need proof. It just needed a whisper. Salem was not just one town, but two. Salem Village, a small, agrarian, and deeply religious settlement, and Salem Town, a larger, more prosperous port with increasing ties to trade and wealth. There was a long-standing tension between the two. The villagers viewed Salem Town with distrust, seeing in its growing economy a shift away from godliness and humility. They believed that wealth corrupted, and in many ways, they were right. The world around them was changing. They were not. That anxiety created fertile ground for division. Disputes over land were common. Family feuds had lasted generations. Some villagers wanted independence from Salem Town's control. Others wanted its prosperity. These weren't abstract quarrels. They were deeply personal. Neighbors fought over fences and livestock. Ministers were hired, then fired. Church members refused to share pews. Petty, bitter, and unresolved, the entire village was one spark away from fire. The Puritans believed in the devil, not as a symbol, but as a real, active force. Satan, to them, was constantly trying to infiltrate the righteous. And witches? Witches were his agents. To be accused of witchcraft was to be accused of treason against God. It meant consorting with the devil, flying at night, cursing children, and signing one's name in blood. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it demanded swift, merciless punishment. Betty and Abigail began naming names. The first three women accused were carefully, perhaps unconsciously, chosen. Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean; Sarah Good, a homeless beggar; and Sarah Osborne, a bedridden woman who hadn't attended church in over a year. None of them had power. None had wealth. None could defend themselves. But their fates would set a precedent. Vulnerability made one guilty. Of all the women, Tituba remains the most enigmatic. She was likely from Barbados or South America. Some accounts say she practiced folk magic, told stories of omens and spirits. Others say she was simply scapegoated for her skin color and outsider status. What we do know is this: under pressure and possible abuse, she confessed. Tituba told a tale that electrified Salem. She said the devil had come to her with the promise of freedom, that she had seen other witches riding on poles, that a tall man in black had given her a book and asked her to sign it. She claimed that there were more witches hiding among them, and that they were plotting to destroy the village. It was a confession that validated every fear the Puritans held and opened the gates to a nightmare. That spark came from a single home, the Paris household. Reverend Samuel Paris was not a beloved figure. A failed businessman turned minister, he was stern, paranoid, and demanding. His sermons were filled with fire and fury, sin, hell, and judgment. He was not paid well and often quarreled with his parishioners about his salary and land entitlements. His presence deepened rifts already splitting the village. In January of 1692, something strange happened in the Paris house. His 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began behaving oddly. They screamed, threw themselves on the floor, barked like dogs, and claimed to see visions of terrifying specters. They complained of being pricked with invisible pins. They contorted their bodies into unnatural shapes and seemed tormented by unseen forces. At first, their symptoms baffled the village. The local doctor, William Griggs, gave a diagnosis that would change the world: witchcraft. More girls began exhibiting the same symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and others. They screamed in court, pointed fingers, and accused anyone who crossed them or seemed unusual. Accusations began to spread beyond the outcast and pour to the respected and godly. Once named, a person's fate was almost sealed. The afflicted girls became celebrities, protected by the court and the ministers. Their words carried the power of death. And to question them, that was to question God's will. A social hierarchy flipped overnight. Young girls ruled the courts. Wealthy merchants cowered. The invisible hand of fear gripped Salem tighter each day. The Puritans didn't just believe they were under attack. They believed they were in a cosmic war. A war between God and Satan. Salem was the battleground. The afflicted girls weren't just victims. They were seen as soldiers of righteousness, battling evil with their voices and bodies. Their fits, their screams, their accusations, these were interpreted as proof of divine truth. And so, the village divided. To some, the trials were a holy cleansing. To others, they were a descent into madness. But no one, not even the ministers, could fully stop what had begun. By spring, dozens of people were in jail. The gallows were being prepared, and fear had become law. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Old grudges resurfaced. Land disputes became death sentences. Even silence could be damning. If you refused to accuse, were you protecting a witch? The community had crossed a line, not by force, but by consent. People wanted to believe. They needed an explanation for their pain, their losses, their fears. The devil was convenient. So were those who looked different, spoke oddly, or lived alone. And so, Salem became a mirror, not of God's will, but of human fear, twisted faith, and the price of unchecked hysteria. January 1692. In the cold heart of Salem village, something strange was happening. Betty Paris, the 9-year-old daughter of Reverend Samuel Paris, and Abigail Williams, his 11-year-old niece, were sick, but this wasn't a sickness the town doctor could treat. Their limbs jerked without warning. They screamed nonsense, hid under furniture, claimed to see specters in the room, shadowy figures, animals with human voices, people who were not there. When Dr. William Griggs was summoned, he gave a chilling diagnosis. The evil hand is upon them. Witchcraft. The moment the word witch left the doctor's mouth, fear took root. It wasn't just a medical opinion. It was a spiritual indictment. But Salem didn't yet know where to point the finger. Then the girls started speaking. Not all at once, but in fragments, in sobs, in screams that erupted in the night. When pressed by Reverend Paris and other adults, they gave names. Names of women they claimed had bewitched them. 3 names echoed through the snow-covered village: Tituba, Paris's enslaved servant; Sarah Good, a poor, homeless beggar; Sarah Osborne, an older woman, bedridden and estranged from church life. Each of them existed on the margins. They were poor, disliked, powerless, and in 1692, that made them the perfect targets. Tituba was the first to be questioned. Born in the Caribbean, likely enslaved in Barbados before arriving in Salem, Tituba had long been a mystery to the villagers. She told stories, sometimes strange ones, and she cared for Betty and Abigail in the Paris household, meaning she was close enough to blame. Under pressure and likely physical abuse, Tituba confessed, but not in the way anyone expected. She told a story that sounded like it was pulled from the devil's own book. She said she had seen a tall man in black who demanded she sign his book. She had flown on a pole, seen other witches, even witnessed a familiar, a creature in the form of a dog, a bird, a pig, speaking in a human voice. Then she said this: "There are others," and that broke Salem. Why did Tituba confess? Historians still debate it. Some believe she was coerced under threat of torture. Others say she was trying to survive, offering the court what it wanted to hear. A third theory suggests she was making a quiet mockery of the situation, playing into the colonists' worst fears to expose their own absurdity. Whatever the reason, her confession was a wildfire. Suddenly, witchcraft wasn't isolated to 1 or 2 women. It was everywhere. It could be anyone. The court now had something new: proof. Or at least, what they believed was proof. And with that came the next phase: escalation. Enter the Putnam family. Thomas and Ann Putnam were one of the wealthiest, most influential families in Salem Village. They had land, they had enemies, and soon their 12-year-old daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., began to show signs of affliction too. Convulsions, visions, screams. She said she saw ghosts, not just witches, but victims. Ghosts of children murdered by witches. She named names too. The Putnams fueled the fire. Some say they truly believed their daughter. Others believe they saw opportunity to settle scores, seize land, or protect their status. Possibly both. Ann Jr. would eventually accuse 62 people, more than any other single person. It wasn't just Ann. Soon there was Elizabeth Hubbard, a 17-year-old orphan living with her uncle, Dr. Griggs. Mercy Lewis, a servant from a family slaughtered by Native Americans in Maine. Mary Walcott, Susanna Sheldon, and others. All claimed to be afflicted. Together, they became a chorus of hysteria, performing in court, collapsing into fits, pointing and screaming when the accused entered the room. Their convulsions were seen as evidence, their word taken as truth. In any other town, they would have been dismissed. But in Salem, in 1692, they were the voice of God's justice. With each passing day, new names emerged. The jails began to fill. People once thought pious were now being dragged from their homes. Some were respectable mothers and churchgoers. Others were already mistrusted, like Martha Corey, who had dared to suggest that the girls might be lying. Her punishment for speaking out? She was accused herself. Once the pattern was clear, that speaking against the trials meant suspicion, no one spoke. Silence became safety. In a deeply religious society, fear is easy to weaponize. The idea that Satan walked among them in the skin of their neighbors allowed deep-seated grudges to bubble up as righteous fury. Land disputes turned into death sentences. Old rivalries re-emerged. A look, a word, a rumor. It was all it took. Accusation became power. And soon, the only way to avoid suspicion was to join in the pointing. To modern minds, the Salem accusations sound absurd. Visions of black dogs, birds speaking human words, ghosts accusing the living, invisible specters attacking in courtrooms. But to the judges and ministers of the time, these claims fit perfectly into their theology. They didn't need wounds. They didn't need fingerprints. They had spectral evidence and faith. That faith justified everything. The tragedy deepened. Men were forced to testify against their own wives, children against parents, servants against masters. Entire families were destroyed from within. One heartbreaking example: Dorothy Good, the 4-year-old daughter of accused witch Sarah Good. Dorothy was imprisoned. She was questioned, pressured. She confessed, or tried to. She told them her mother had a snake that talked to her. To the court, that was enough. She was jailed for 9 months, chained in a dungeon, barely clothed. She would never fully recover. By spring, Dozens had been accused, men and women, young and old, rich and poor. Salem's jails overflowed. Some suspects were sent to neighboring towns. Others languished without trial. Those who confessed were often spared death, though not freedom. Those who refused were tried, and soon they would be executed. While hysteria ruled the village, not everyone believed. Some ministers in nearby towns, like Reverend John Wise of Ipswich, expressed doubt. Others, like Cotton Mather, walked a delicate line, cautioning against overzealous prosecution while still defending the existence of witches. But in Salem Village, such doubt was dangerous. To question the afflicted girls was to question God, and so the line between reality and delusion disappeared. By late spring, the machine of accusation had reached a point of no return. May 1692. Governor William Phips returns to Massachusetts from England and finds a colony consumed by fear. He responds by creating a new court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to deal with the backlog. Soon, real trials would begin, and with them, real executions. On May 27th, 1692, the colony's newly arrived governor, Sir William Phips, established a special court to deal with the growing number of accused witches. It bore an imposing name, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, from the French meaning to hear and determine. Its purpose was singular: to bring the accused to trial swiftly. The jails were full. The town was impatient. The devil, they believed, would not wait. Neither could they. But what they created wasn't a court of fairness. It was a machine built to confirm guilt, not question it. The court was led by 7 men, most notably Chief Justice William Stoughton, a strict Puritan with little patience for doubt or delay. His role would prove critical. Stoughton believed the afflicted girls. He accepted their visions as divine evidence, and under his guidance, the court embraced a kind of logic that required no proof, only belief. Other judges included Jonathan Corwin, John Hathorne, ancestor of author Nathaniel Hawthorne, Samuel Sewell, and Bartholomew Gedney. None were trained in English law. Most were landowners and merchants, not legal scholars. But that didn't matter. The law in Salem was whatever they said it was. The court's first test came swiftly. On June 2nd, 1692, they tried Bridget Bishop, a twice-widowed woman known for wearing bright red clothes and speaking her mind. She ran a tavern, played shuffleboard. Gossip followed her like perfume. She was different. That was enough. The afflicted girls screamed and collapsed in court as she stood before them. They claimed she was biting them, choking them, stabbing them with invisible knives. The judges watched them writhing on the floor and nodded gravely. Bridget denied everything. But the court didn't need a confession. They had spectral evidence. What was spectral evidence? It was a ghost, a vision, a claim that the accused spirit had left their body to torment the afflicted. In today's courts, it would be laughed out of the room. In Salem, it was damning. The logic was twisted but effective. The devil could not take the shape of an innocent person. So, if a girl saw your specter, your guilt was confirmed, not just suspected, but proven. It didn't matter if you had an alibi. It didn't matter if you were asleep in your bed. The spirit could act alone. Invisible crimes, unprovable defenses. Salem's justice had become a faith trial. Bridget Bishop was convicted and sentenced to death. On June 10th, 1692, she became the first person hanged for witchcraft during the trials. They brought her to Gallows Hill, just outside the town. There was no ceremony, no priest, no mercy. She died with the rope around her neck and the sky full of judgment. She would not be the last. With Bridget's execution, the court moved faster. More names, more arrests, more hangings. Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Rebecca Nurse. One by one, they were dragged into court. Many elderly, frail, God-fearing women who had done nothing more than live long enough to become strange to younger eyes. The afflicted girls convulsed and screamed. The judges took notes. The executioner sharpened his blade. By the end of July, 5 more people were hanged. The machine was well oiled now. The trial soon took on a brutal new logic. To be accused was to be suspect. To defend an accused witch meant you were a sympathizer, maybe even a witch yourself. People who testified for the defense found themselves accused days later. This created a chilling silence. No one dared speak. Neighbors stopped helping each other. Friends avoided eye contact in the streets. The safest thing you could do was accuse someone else first. Perhaps the most shocking case to come before the court was that of George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village, a Harvard graduate, a man of the cloth. He had quarreled with Salem's leadership in the past. He had left the village years earlier, but old grudges lingered. The afflicted girls claimed he was the leader of the witches, that he had performed supernatural feats of strength, that he had baptized them in the devil's name. During his trial, he stood tall, calm, dignified. He cited scripture. He recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something witches were supposedly incapable of doing. The crowd wavered. But Judge Stoughton didn't. He reminded the people that the devil could quote the Bible too. And so on August 19th, 1692, George Burroughs was hanged on Gallows Hill, a former pastor, executed as a servant of Satan. Some refused to plead at all. One such man was Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer. He was accused along with his wife, Martha, who had voiced concern about the trials. That, too, was enough. Giles, when brought before the court, said nothing. He knew the law. If he refused to plead, they could not legally seize his property. So the court ordered him pressed. They laid a wooden board on his chest, placed rocks on top. Then more, and more, and more. They asked, "Do you plead guilty or innocent?" Each time, He answered the same. More weight. It took 2 days. He died on September 19th, crushed to death by stone and silence. The executions began to come in clusters. September 22nd, 1692. 8 people were hanged in a single day, including Martha Corey and Mary Easty, both of whom had protested the trials and begged for reason. Jails overflowed. Over 150 people had been accused. Even animals were not safe. 2 dogs were executed for showing signs of witchcraft. Logic had completely abandoned Salem. Fear was now its god. Even as the court carried out its grim work, cracks began to show. Reverend Increase Mather, father of the influential Cotton Mather, began speaking out. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person be condemned. Others, like Thomas Brattle, a respected Boston merchant, wrote public letters criticizing the court's reliance on spectral evidence. The tide was beginning to shift, but inside the courtroom, the cries still echoed. And outside, the gallows still stood tall against the sky. The court of Oyer and Terminer lasted just 5 months, from June to October 1692. In that time, 19 people were hanged, 1 was pressed to death, and several died in jail. Hundreds more lived in fear, some accused but never tried, others too poor to escape the prison walls. This wasn't justice. It was terror, made legal. In October 1692, Governor Phipps, perhaps alarmed by the growing unease, dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. In its place, he created the Superior Court of Judicature, which would no longer allow spectral evidence. It was the first breath of reason in a season of madness. Many of those awaiting trial were released, but the damage had already been done. The court had been a guillotine in all but name, swift, relentless, and blind. By June, the town had crossed a line that could no longer be undone. The accusations had multiplied. The jails were overflowing. Dozens had been imprisoned. Some still awaited trial. Others had already been judged by the whispers of girls and the will of God. Now, it was time for executions. June 10th, 1692. Bridget Bishop, the first to die. She was everything Puritan society mistrusted. Outspoken, independent, flirtatious. She wore red, ran a tavern, had been married more than once, and she'd already faced witchcraft allegations years earlier. This time, she wouldn't survive it. Despite her protestations of innocence, the court sentenced her to death. She was led to a hill just outside Salem. The gallows had been built in haste. She was hanged, with no minister present. The people watched. Some felt relief. Others looked away. Bridget's execution did something else. It set precedent. Now that a hanging had taken place, it became easier for the court to sentence others, easier for the crowd to accept it, easier to look at a neighbor and wonder if they were next. And so, the executions began to come in waves. July 19th, 5 more hanged. Sarah Good, the homeless woman with sharp words and a colder glare. Elizabeth Howe, a mother of 6, accused after a neighbor's child fell ill. Susanna Martin, accused of laughing during prayer. Sarah Wilds, from a family that had long-standing feuds with the Putnams. Rebecca Nurse, a respected elderly woman known for her piety, whose guilt shocked the entire community. She was 71 years old. Even after her conviction, many couldn't believe it. How could such a kind, devout woman be a witch? But the girls said she came to them in dreams. The court didn't need more. Gallows Hill became a place of pilgrimage. Some came to weep. Others came to witness. The accused were carried by ox cart, often in chains, heads bowed, surrounded by armed guards. Ministers would sometimes preach to the crowds, but no comfort was given to the condemned. No last rites, no prayers, only silence and rope. And when the bodies swung, they were left to hang for hours. A warning, a statement, a triumph of so-called justice. Afterward, they were buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Some families retrieved the corpses secretly at night, but others were never claimed. By August, the pace had intensified. August 19th, 5 more executions. This time, the crowd saw something unexpected. One of the condemned was George Burroughs, a former minister. Educated, articulate, respected. He was accused of leading a secret coven, of being the witches' general. On the gallows, as the noose was tightened around his neck, Burroughs did something incredible. He recited the Lord's Prayer, clearly, without error. This was supposed to be impossible for witches. The crowd wavered. Murmurs spread. Eyes turned to the judges. But Chief Justice Stoughton stood firm. He declared that even the devil could disguise himself as light. And so the order was given. Burroughs died, his prayer unfinished, in the air. Among the August victims was Martha Carrier, whose story deserves more than a name on a list. A mother of 4, she had spoken out against the trials. Her defiance made her dangerous. She was accused of causing plagues, deaths, even making crops fail. One of her sons was tortured until he claimed his mother had made him a witch. Her trial was loud, violent, chaotic. She remained composed. "I am wronged. It is a shameful thing that you should listen to such testimony." Her strength only deepened their fear. She was hanged beside Burroughs. Her body fell, but her voice would echo in history. Not all died by rope. Some, like Giles Corey, met a fate far crueler. A farmer in his 80s, Giles was accused after his wife, Martha Corey, had already been jailed. But Giles refused to plead guilty or innocent. He knew that by refusing to enter a plea, the court couldn't seize his land. It would pass to his children. So they pressed him. They laid him on the ground, placed a board over his chest, then rocks, one by one, more weight, more pain. For 2 days, he said nothing. Only one phrase passed his lips, more weight. He died on September 19th. Bones crushed, ribs split, Lungs collapsed. No one ever suffered longer under the court's justice. 8 executions in a single day. The gallows creaked until sundown. Among the dead, Martha Corey, wife of Giles, punished for doubting the girls. Mary Easty, sister of Rebecca Nurse and just as devout. Anne Putitor, accused of using witch ointments. Samuel Wardwell, a man who had once confessed, then recanted. 3 others, each executed for little more than being unusual, unlucky, or unwanted. The scale was staggering. That day marked the last executions of the trials, but no one knew that yet. As the bodies were removed, Salem stood on the edge of collapse. It's easy to wonder, why didn't they fight back? The truth is, they tried, but the rules had changed. To deny the accusation was to invite more suspicion. To defend the accused made you one of them. To question the girls was to blaspheme against God. There was no logic, no consistency, no safe ground. People gave in out of fear, not belief. And those who stayed silent often lived. But they never forgot what their silence cost. As the executions continued, the jails remained full. Some prisoners waited months without trial. Children, like Dorothy Good, age 4, remained locked in darkness. Women gave birth in chains. Many died from exposure, starvation, or disease. There was no effort to provide comfort, no acknowledgement of innocence. Guilt was presumed. Release came only with confession or death. By October, the public began to doubt. When respected figures like George Burroughs and Rebecca Nurse were executed, people started asking, what if the court was wrong? Some ministers spoke privately of concern. Others openly warned against further executions. Letters circulated. Protests whispered. Even Governor Phipps, upon returning to Salem, grew uneasy at the chaos. He suspended the court of Oyer and Terminer on October 29, 1692. By then, 19 people had been hanged, 1 pressed to death, and more than 150 jailed. The summer had done what no enemy ever could. It had broken the soul of Salem. By late October 1692, Salem was no longer a place of whispers. It was a town of echoes. The executions had paused, but the fear remained. The air was tense, brittle. A single word, a glance, still had the power to destroy a life. More than 150 people were still rotting in jails. Children, elders, ministers, mothers. The gallows stood still, but they were not dismantled. People began to ask the question that no one dared ask in the summer. What if this was all wrong? As early as August, some had started to speak out, softly, carefully. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the most influential religious leaders in New England, stepped forward. Unlike his son Cotton Mather, who had supported the trials, though with occasional caution, Increase made a public statement. It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned. This was radical. In a world where suspicion was treated as guilt, Mather's words shook the foundation of the trials. Governor William Phipps had been away, fighting in the East, managing defenses in Maine. But upon returning to Salem in October, he found the colony in chaos. Even his own wife had been named as a potential witch. That was enough. On October 29, 1692, he dissolved the court of Oyer and Terminer. A new court would be formed, the Superior Court of Judicature, and with it, a new rule. Spectral evidence was no longer allowed. The invisible visions of girls would no longer determine life or death. The spell was starting to crack. In January 1693, the new court began its work. It reviewed many of the remaining cases. With the old evidence now discredited, the trials looked different, quieter, less dramatic, and far less deadly. Many prisoners were found not guilty. Others had their charges dismissed entirely, but not all were so lucky. 3 people were convicted and sentenced to hang under the new court. But Phipps, now fully turned against the trials, overruled the executions and pardoned them. The girls who started it all, Abigail Williams, Betty Paris, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, they slipped away from history. Some left town. Others died young. Some simply faded into anonymity. But one of them, Ann Putnam Jr., would do something no one expected. In 1706, at the age of 26, she stood before the church and gave a public confession. I desire to be humbled before God for the accusing and condemning of several persons to death. She blamed it on delusion, on being misled by Satan. But the damage had long been done. Samuel Sewall, one of the few judges to later express remorse, stood in church one Sunday in 1697 during a day of public fasting. He handed a written confession to the minister, which was read aloud before the entire congregation. I desire to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men and especially of God. He wore sackcloth in private for the rest of his life. The others, Judge Stoughton, John Hathorne, Corwin, never apologized. Stoughton, in fact, would later serve as acting governor of Massachusetts. His conscience was silent. History, however, would not be. Those who survived the trials didn't return to normal life. Their names were blackened. Some had lost land. Others had lost children, spouses, futures. Even those who had confessed under duress were left with permanent stains. Many died in poverty. Others left the colony entirely, trying to rebuild in towns where their names meant nothing. There were no reparations, no therapy, just silence and scars. In 1711, nearly 20 years after the trials, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill offering financial compensation to some victims and their families. It was a small sum. Not everyone was included. Some families refused the money out of principle. Others needed it simply to survive. It wasn't justice. It was an acknowledgement, quiet, limited, and overdue. Even after the trials had ended, Salem was never the same. The churches that once praised the judges grew quiet. Ministers who once shouted for justice now spoke in vague repentance. Some families, like the Putnams, stayed and held power. Others, like the nurses, carried their grief for generations. Salem Village itself changed its name in 1752 to Danvers, Massachusetts, an attempt to erase the memory. But the memory would not fade. For years after, New England tiptoed around the subject of witchcraft. No more executions followed, not in Salem and not in Massachusetts. But the pattern had already been set. Fear could override reason. Faith could silence justice. A rumor could become a death sentence. And perhaps worst of all, no one had to pay for it. The court of Oyer and Terminer had been dissolved. Executions had ceased. The last prisoners were slowly released, some after months, others after years. The crisis had passed, but Salem Village was broken, not in body, but in soul. More than 200 people had been accused. 19 were hanged. 1 pressed to death. At least 5 died in prison. Countless more were psychologically shattered. And yet, the town never held a trial for those who caused the damage. No judge was removed. No accuser was punished. No law was passed to prevent this from happening again. Salem tried to forget, but forgetting is hard. When your neighbor's child was hanged, when the woman who once nursed your wounds died on the gallows, when your own silence kept someone else in chains. There were quiet rifts. Some families, like the Putnams, retained power despite their role in fueling the hysteria. Others, like the Porters, the nurses, and the Proctors, lived with grief, shame, and whispered resentment. The church tried to restore normalcy. Ministers avoided the topic, but the sermons felt hollow, the pews more empty, the silences longer. Not all who were imprisoned were hanged, but survival came at a price. Many returned home to nothing. Livestock were gone, homes sold to pay legal fees, families scattered or dead. Some, like Elizabeth Proctor, were spared the gallows because they were pregnant. She gave birth in prison before finally being released. Her husband, John Proctor, had already been executed. Others never recovered from the trauma of confinement. Sarah Good's daughter, Dorothy, was only 4 years old when imprisoned. She was never the same. Sarah Osborne, one of the first accused, died chained to the floor before her trial even began. Only one accuser, Ann Putnam Jr., ever offered a public apology. In 1706, she stood in front of the Salem Village Church and read a statement. "I desire to be humbled before God for accusing several persons of a grievous crime, whereby their lives were taken away from them." She claimed she had been deluded by Satan But for many, it was too little, too late. Her words were accepted by the church, but not all the families she had condemned. Samuel Sewell, one of the few judges to publicly repent, spent the rest of his life wearing black on each anniversary of the first execution. He even wrote essays denouncing slavery and wrongful punishment. But Judge Stoughton, the man who oversaw most of the executions, never apologized. He continued to rise in political power. He died wealthy, respected, and unrepentant. John Hathorne, another judge, also refused to show remorse. His name would live on through his great-great-grandson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter, who added a W to his surname to distance himself from the family shame. In 1711, the colonial government passed a bill to offer monetary reparations to the families of some of the wrongly accused and executed. A total of £600 was distributed among a few households. But many families were excluded. Others refused to accept the money. How can you put a price on a mother's life? A husband's dignity? A ruined name? For most, the scars remained unpaid. The money came too late, and it could not buy back the dead. In 1752, Salem Village was renamed Danvers. It was an attempt to erase the stain, but names can't hide history. And though the new name gave the people a fresh start, it never stopped tourists, historians, and descendants from returning, seeking answers. Salem Town, now simply Salem, embraced its infamous past more openly. Over the centuries, it became a symbol, a curiosity, and a brand. Though no records exist of formal therapy, survivors exhibited what we now recognize as trauma symptoms: nightmares, isolation, religious doubt, avoidance of crowds and public gatherings, extreme guilt, especially among those who confessed under pressure. Many turned inward. Some lost their faith entirely. Others clung to it harder, as if trying to bury their shame under prayer. One of the most disturbing aspects of the aftermath was the silence from religious leaders. Most ministers who had supported the trials never addressed them again. They moved on, gave sermons on other sins. The sermons that once warned of witches now warned of slander, but the word Salem wasn't spoken. It was as though they hoped the memory would dissolve with time. But memory has a long half-life, and the people did not forget. For the children of Salem, the trials became a lesson learned in fear. Some had watched their mothers hanged. Others had spent months chained in darkness. Many grew up in a town where no one spoke of what had happened. A ghost town in spirit, if not in name. Generations carried the silence like inheritance. Few wrote memoirs. Most simply disappeared into history. It wasn't until the 19th century that Salem began to appear in historical texts in earnest. Writers and scholars, both American and British, used the trials as a warning of what could happen when faith overpowers evidence, when fear silences reason, and when people stopped seeing each other as human. Salem became a metaphor for mass hysteria, for scapegoating, for broken justice. A cautionary tale with too many modern parallels. There are few historical events that have lived as many lives as the Salem Witch Trials. What happened in a small Puritan village over 300 years ago has been rewritten, repackaged, and reborn as a cautionary tale, a ghost story, a tourist attraction, and a cultural mirror. But along the way, myth overtook memory, and truth was buried beneath drama. Let's begin with what didn't happen. Myth number 1. The witches were burned at the stake falls. In Salem, no one was burned. The accused were hanged, not burned, a distinction important in colonial law. Burning witches was a European practice, not a New England one. Myth number 2. They were executed for practicing witchcraft. Technically, they were executed for being suspected of witchcraft. Most had no connection to folklore, spells, or herbal remedies. They were neighbors, midwives, farmers, and churchgoers, made suspicious by behavior, reputation, or mere proximity. Myth number 3. They were all women, not true. Of the 20 executed, 5 were men. Dozens more were accused. Husbands, ministers, even children. Salem was not a feminist morality play. It was a collapse of social order, and anyone could fall. Stories grow sharper in the retelling. The more horrifying, the more memorable. Burning is visual, dramatic, final. Hanging is cold, bureaucratic, silent. But truth is not always cinematic, and so myth takes its place. The Salem Witch Trials entered folklore because it offered something for everyone. A horror story for the superstitious, a morality tale for the religious, a political allegory for the oppressed, a dramatic arc for writers and filmmakers. And over time, the story became not what was, but what we needed it to be. In 1953, Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible, a play that retold the Salem Witch Trials as a thinly veiled critique of McCarthyism. During the Cold War, Americans were accusing one another of being communists, with little evidence and devastating consequences. Miller saw the parallel. So, he resurrected Salem. He turned Abigail Williams into a seductive villain, John Proctor into a tragic hero, and the town into a cauldron of fear, hypocrisy, and righteous fury. The Crucible became the version of the trials most people know today. Taught in schools, staged in theaters, quoted in politics. But it's not historically accurate. Abigail was 11, not 17. John Proctor was 60, not 35. They never had an affair. Many characters were altered or invented. Still, the emotional truth resonated. And so fiction replaced fact with the author's blessing. After the Crucible, Salem's image exploded across books, films, and television. Witches became romanticized, vilified, and commercialized all at once. Bewitched, 1964 to 72, turned the witch into a suburban housewife. The Blair Witch Project, 1999, drew on Salem's darkness and ambiguity. Hocus Pocus, 1993, transformed the town into a playground of nostalgia and kitsch. American Horror Story, Sabrina, Chilling Adventures, and more continued the trend. Witches were no longer just victims or villains. They were now symbols of rebellion, of feminism, of mystery, of power, and Salem was the birthplace. Walk through modern-day Salem in October, and you'll see what the town has become. Psychics offering readings, stores selling crystals, spell books, and authentic witch relics, wax museums and haunted houses, actors dressed as judges, Puritans, and ghosts. Salem has monetized its past, and opinions vary on whether that's catharsis or commodification. Descendants of the accused sometimes speak out against the spectacle. Others embrace it, seeing it as education wrapped in entertainment. But it raises an uncomfortable truth. How much suffering must a place endure before its pain becomes someone else's pastime? In recent decades, the witch has been reclaimed. No longer just a Halloween costume or a fairy tale trope, the witch became a feminist figure, independent, non-conforming, feared by patriarchy, connected to nature, mystery, and rebellion. Salem, in this narrative, is not a place of shame, but of awakening. The women executed in 1692 were not seen as witches, but as early martyrs in the fight against oppression. This reinterpretation is powerful, but again, it simplifies a complex truth. Many of the accused were religious, submissive, traditional. Some were even anti-witchcraft themselves. Still, in myth, they become more than victims. They become symbols, which can be more useful than facts. Salem's transformation wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. In the 1970s, after a century of decline, the town began to promote itself as a Halloween destination. Statues were erected, museums created, events scheduled. The economic impact was undeniable. Today, over 1 million people visit Salem each year, most in October. The town lives in two worlds. The historical Salem, grim, pious, tragic. The imagined Salem, magical, campy, enchanted. They overlap, argue, and coexist. And perhaps they always will. Artists, poets, and novelists have returned to Salem again and again. Nathaniel Hawthorne, haunted by his great-great-grandfather's role as a judge, wrote The Scarlet Letter as a meditation on public shame and moral rigidity. Shirley Jackson, in The Lottery, captured the cold cruelty of mob violence and scapegoating, themes born in Salem. Countless horror authors, from Stephen King to modern YA writers, have drawn upon the Salem archetype. Even music videos, fashion lines, and TikTok influencers have mined the image of the witch for style, rebellion, and identity. Salem is no longer a place. It's an idea, an aesthetic, a warning. The Salem Witch Trials have been analyzed for centuries. Historians, psychologists, sociologists, and writers have all asked the same question. What really caused it? Was it religion? Politics? Greed? Trauma? The answer is not one, but many. Because Salem wasn't just a tragedy, it was a mirror. And what it reflected was human nature under pressure. At its core, Salem was about fear. The people feared disease, invasion, starvation, damnation. Their crops failed. Children died. War raged nearby. Native attacks had decimated towns just miles away. Their world was small and collapsing. In such a world, people look for control. And when they can't find it, they look for someone to blame. Blame becomes comfort, even if it's false, especially if it's convenient. That's how neighbors became enemies, how suspicion became certainty, how fear created its own reality. Many of the afflicted girls, especially Mercy Lewis, were survivors of brutal Native American attacks during King William's War. They had seen parents slaughtered, homes burned, villages erased. What we might now call PTSD, they called the devil's hand. Their screams in court, their visions, their fits. Could these have been expressions of trauma, of unprocessed grief, of fear with no outlet? We'll never know for certain. But trauma often finds a voice, and in Salem, that voice spoke in accusations. More than 75% of the accused were women. Women who were widowed, childless, outspoken, economically independent. Strange. In a deeply patriarchal society, these women were viewed as dangerous simply for existing outside expected roles. They were midwives, landowners, healers. Some were assertive, others simply unlucky. But the message was clear. Step outside your box, and you will be burned by it. Even the men accused, like John Proctor and George Burroughs, were punished for defending women, challenging authority, or simply not conforming. Salem wasn't just punishing witches, it was enforcing hierarchy. Follow the land. That's what some historians say, because many of the accused, especially those who refused to confess, owned desirable land. Once convicted, their property could be seized by the state or fall into the hands of accusers. The Putnams, central figures in the accusations, were locked in long-standing land disputes with many of the condemned. Coincidence? Perhaps. But history rarely deals in coincidence. It deals in power. And Salem was a place where power was shifting, and people were willing to kill for it. This theory has become a favorite of psychologists. Mass hysteria, or conversion disorder, is when a group of people begin to exhibit physical symptoms with no medical explanation, triggered by stress, fear, or social suggestion. In 1692, the symptoms were seizures, visions, animal sounds. Today, they might be fainting, paralysis, or tremors. We've seen similar events in schools, workplaces, even convents across the world. What happened in Salem may have been the first recorded outbreak in North America, but it wouldn't be the last. In the 1970s, a bold new theory emerged: a hallucinogenic fungus called ergot. Ergot grows on rye and can cause symptoms similar to LSD. Visions, convulsions, paranoia. Could spoiled bread have poisoned the villagers? The climate in 1691 was unusually damp, perfect for ergot, and many of the afflicted lived near a common grain source. It's compelling, but it's also incomplete. Ergot doesn't explain why the accusations stopped suddenly, or why some townspeople were affected and others not. Still, it's a reminder. Even the most extraordinary events can have ordinary causes. No single theory explains Salem, because no single event caused it. The trials happened because everything failed at once. Religion became law. Gossip became evidence. Fear became a weapon. Power went unchecked. Truth became irrelevant. It wasn't the devil. It was people, just like us, caught in a storm of their own making. A perfect storm of belief, fear, power, and silence. Perhaps the real danger in Salem wasn't witches or the people accused of being them. It was the belief that certainty required no proof, that someone's word or someone's silence was enough to condemn, that once the crowd had chosen a villain, nothing else mattered. This idea lives on in courts, in politics, in social media, in classrooms. We no longer hang witches, but we still destroy lives with accusation alone. And we still tell ourselves we're doing it for good. Salem is not just a historical event. It's a case study in what happens when justice bends to fear. A reminder that rational people can do irrational things. Good people can commit evil in the name of virtue. Silence helps the rope tighten. And that no one is safe when truth becomes optional. Almost 50 years before the gallows rose in Salem, another witch panic had swept through the New World. In Hartford, Connecticut, 1647, a woman named Alcee Young became the first person in the American colonies to be executed for witchcraft. There was no written record of her trial, no defense, just one chilling note in a town ledger. Alcee Young was hanged. Over the next few decades, more would follow in Hartford and surrounding towns. Accusations rose, fear spread, and in many ways, Connecticut set the template that Salem would follow: neighbor accusing neighbor, fueled by religion and superstition. The seeds were already planted. Salem was simply the most fertile ground. Salem's trials may be infamous, but they were part of a much larger wave, one that had started in Europe centuries earlier. From the 1400s to the 1700s, tens of thousands of people were executed across the continent for witchcraft. Germany led the death toll, with entire villages purged. In Scotland, women were drowned or burned. England relied on hangings, much like Salem. In France, the Inquisition used torture and fire. The accusations followed patterns. Midwives and widows, herbalists and outsiders, those who broke rules, those who made no sound at all. What united them? A shared belief that evil walked in flesh and had to be destroyed by fire, rope, or iron. The American colonies, founded by those very same Europeans, carried that belief like luggage. It arrived with them and never left. So what made Salem so iconic? Why do we remember it when hundreds of other witch trials have been forgotten? 1. Speed and scale. The trials escalated quickly, from one accusation to over 200 in just months. 2. Documentation. Because of meticulous record-keeping and later efforts to preserve court transcripts, we know what happened, word by word. 3. Collapse and remorse. Unlike most other trials, Salem ended with public shame. Judges apologized. Accusers confessed. Compensation was paid. That reckoning made Salem unique and unforgettable. 4. Symbolism. Salem occurred at the intersection of fear, faith, and justice. It became a perfect story, easy to retell and hard to ignore. It's not the only story, but it's the one we chose to remember. After Salem, public appetite for witch hunts diminished, but the embers still glowed. Virginia, 1706. A woman named Grace Sherwood was accused of killing livestock, cursing crops, and turning into a cat. She was subjected to a trial by water, bound and thrown into a river. If she floated, she was guilty. She floated. She was imprisoned for 8 years. Decades later, she was released. 3 centuries after that, she was pardoned by the state of Virginia in 2006. New Jersey, 1730. Jane Updike was accused of bewitching cattle. She was acquitted, but the townspeople remained convinced. She was shunned, her children harassed. The trial ended, but the punishment continued. North Carolina, 1741. A black enslaved woman named Grace was hanged after a forced confession. Her name was erased, her trial unrecorded. Only her execution remained. The echoes were quieter now, but still deadly. By the 1950s, America faced a new kind of witch hunt, one without witches. Senator Joseph McCarthy began accusing fellow Americans of being communists, spies, and traitors. Evidence was optional. Fear was required. People lost jobs, careers, reputations. Some went to prison. Others committed suicide. And in this madness, Arthur Miller, author of The Crucible, saw the ghosts of Salem rise again. His play drew a straight line between 1692 and 1953. Accusation without proof, silence as complicity, punishment without justice. Salem was no longer about witches. It was about what happens when truth is no longer necessary. In today's world, witch trials wear new faces. We call them cancel culture, call-outs, mob justice. One tweet, one photo, one moment, and the court of public opinion demands blood. Careers are destroyed, lives ruined. Sometimes the punishment is justified, other times it's not. The difference? We no longer need a courtroom. We need a hashtag. And just like in Salem, confession can save you, but silence can damn you faster. Why does Salem echo across time? Because the conditions that created it are not locked in the past. They are part of us. The desire to belong, even if it means pointing fingers. The fear of the unknown, especially when it wears a familiar face. The hunger for control, even if the cost is someone else's life. Every time a group is scapegoated, every time a community gives up on reason, every time a crowd demands punishment over understanding, we're back in Salem. Different tools, different names, same storm. Salem's gallows claimed 20 lives. The names of those executed became etched into history. Proctor, Nurse, Corey, Good. But what about the others? Those who were imprisoned and never tried. Those who died in silence. Those who were too young to understand what was happening and too powerless to escape it. The Salem Witch Trials were not just about death. They were about suffering, and much of that suffering was unseen. Dorothy Good was just 4 years old when she was accused of witchcraft. Her mother, Sarah Good, had already been arrested. Poor, homeless, and sharp-tongued, Sarah was an easy target. But the court wanted more. So they questioned Dorothy, alone, confused, terrified. She told them about a snake her mother gave her, a detail the court took as evidence of a demonic familiar. They imprisoned her, chained, in a dark, cold cell for 9 months. She witnessed her mother taken away and never returned. Sarah Good was hanged in July 1692. Dorothy survived, but she was never the same. Witnesses said she became mentally unstable, a child broken by justice. Several of the accused were pregnant when arrested. Elizabeth Proctor, wife of John Proctor, gave birth while shackled. Sarah Good, while awaiting trial, gave birth to a daughter. That baby died in prison. No doctor, no proper bed, no midwife. Just stone walls and rusted chains. Imagine bringing life into a world where death was being prepared for you. Imagine a newborn never feeling sunlight. Not all victims wore ropes. Some wore diapers. and never made it out. We remember those who stood at the gallows, but not those who rotted in jail. Anne Foster, an elderly widow from Andover, died after weeks of starvation and neglect. She had confessed under torture, but died before she could be executed. Lydia Dustin, also elderly, died in prison after being declared innocent because she couldn't pay her jail fees. That's right, even the innocent had to pay to be released. If you couldn't afford the fines, you stayed. And if you stayed, you might die. For every accused, there was a family watching, husbands and wives, parents, children. Some spoke out, most did not. Fear silenced them, or shame. The Nurse family gathered secretly to bury Rebecca's body in their family plot. The Coreys tried to protect their land from seizure. The Proctor children were orphaned. The Good family was scattered. No trials recorded these heartbreaks. No judge heard their stories. But their grief was just as real and just as devastating. Some confessed not out of guilt, but out of agony. Mary Lacey, Deliverance Hobbs, and Sarah Churchill were threatened, isolated, and broken by interrogators. They said whatever the judges wanted to hear. They gave names, invented stories, swore they flew through the night with Satan, and when the next day came, they awoke in chains, even deeper in the nightmare. These weren't confessions. They were survival tactics, but they left scars all the same. Those who confessed and lived were never fully free. They were released into a society that had heard them admit, under oath, that they served the devil, even if that confession had been coerced, even if it was the only thing that saved their life. It followed them. They were shunned, watched, judged. They became living ghosts in their own homes, and their children bore the burden too, carrying family names soiled by fear. In Salem, even animals were accused. 2 dogs were executed after being deemed familiars, supernatural servants of witches. One was shot, the other hanged. They were said to bark unusually, to follow the wrong people, to exist near suspected witches. They were killed not because they were evil, but because fear doesn't need logic. It just needs a reason. We remember Tituba, the enslaved woman from the Caribbean whose confession helped ignite the fire. But we rarely talk about what she endured. Beaten, threatened, interrogated for days, then coerced into an elaborate, nightmarish story that told her captors exactly what they wanted to hear. She lived, but she was never freed. Her fate after release is unknown. Perhaps sold to another household, perhaps buried in an unmarked grave. She lit the match, yes, but only because her hands were tied to the torch. Not every accused has a full court record. Some were never tried, never sentenced, just whispered about, imprisoned, forgotten. The records are full of gaps, pages missing, names cut off, fates uncertain. And we must ask, how many others died nameless in a cell? How many were accused and never recorded? How many were spared the rope, but not the stain? We may never know. but we can listen, even if the story comes in fragments. Salem did not burn. It did not fall. There was no civil war, no revolution, but something cracked in its soul, and it never fully healed. The ropes were cut, the prisoners released, the sermon stopped, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was shame, heavy, unspoken, shared. And that silence, perhaps, was the real curse. Many looked back on Salem and saw it as a period of madness. But it was more than that. It was a mirror. And it kept showing up, generation after generation, in different forms, wearing different masks. Each time, people said, "This isn't Salem." But it always was, just modernized, streamlined. The curse wasn't in spell books or familiars. It was in the fear of the other, the power of accusation, the abandonment of evidence, the comfort of silence. These were the ingredients, and they remain with us. We've seen Salem's ghost in McCarthyism, the Satanic Panic, internment camps, digital mob justice, religious purges, political purges. The tools changed, the stakes changed, but the structure stayed the same. A fear takes root, a name is whispered, a crowd gathers, proof becomes optional. Apologies come only when it's too late. It's the same ritual, only the victims are new. Modern-day Salem, Massachusetts is two towns. One is a historic place filled with plaques, cemeteries, and museums. The other is a carnival, spell shops, fortune tellers, ghost tours, and costume parades. Some see this as healing, reclaiming what was once a place of terror. Others see it as profiting from pain, a commercial curse where truth is sold beside t-shirts and tarot decks. But the truth is that Salem never stopped telling its story. And maybe that's the best thing it can do. The witch today is no longer a monster in the woods. She is a feminist icon, a symbol of independence, a metaphor for resistance, a person society tried to silence and failed to erase. Books, TV shows, and films now paint witches not as villains, but as survivors, as misunderstood, as targeted, as punished for daring to be different. And Salem becomes a lesson in what not to do, or at least what to do differently this time. Despite all that's been written, dramatized, and mythologized, many lessons from Salem remain unlearned. Accusations still travel faster than facts. Fear still overrides evidence. Systems still favor the powerful. And apologies still arrive long after the damage is done. We look back at 1692 and ask, how could they believe such nonsense? But the better question might be, what nonsense do we believe now because we are afraid to question it? Today, no one is hanged for witchcraft, but people still lose reputations, livelihoods, freedom, lives, not through courts, but through public opinion, corporate boards, and invisible systems. The rope is gone. The rush to judgment is not. Salem doesn't haunt us because of the dead. It haunts us because of the living, because we see ourselves in them. The frightened girl who thinks she saw something, the angry man who seizes the moment, the judge who won't admit he's wrong, the neighbor who stays silent to save themselves, the prisoner who knows the truth doesn't matter. We are all in this story. We always were. That's why it endures. 1692 ended. The execution stopped. But Salem's final lesson was this: truth is fragile. Fear is contagious. Silence is complicity. And justice is not inevitable. It is earned, protected, and constantly under threat. That is not a story from the past. It is a warning for the present and a guide for the future. Salem was not cursed by witches. It was cursed by fear and the belief that we are above it. That curse has not lifted, but perhaps if we listen, it can be broken